The night sky burned red. Flames licked the horizon where the forest once stood, and the air trembled with the sound of distant artillery. Captain Samuel Reed pressed his back against the charred hull of a Sherman tank, his heart hammering as tracer fire stitched across the field. "Keep your heads down," he shouted, though his voice was swallowed by the roar of the guns. Mud splashed his face as a shell landed nearby. He stumbled, coughing, dragging his medic bag through the sludge toward a fallen soldier crying out for help. The man's leg was shredded below the knee. Reed dropped beside him, hands steady despite the chaos. Morphine. Bandage. Tourniquet. The routine was his only anchor in the madness. "You're going to be fine, Private," he said, though he knew it was a lie. A burst of machine gun fire tore into the ground meters away. Corporal Hayes, his closest friend and fellow medic, slid behind a broken cart, blood streaked across his cheek. "We can't stay here, Sam," he yelled over the din. "Command says pull back to the treeline." Reed didn't answer. He tied the bandage tighter, ignoring the soldier's screams. There was no time for comfort, only work. When the bleeding slowed, he grabbed the wounded man under the shoulders. Hayes appeared beside him, cursing, and together they dragged the soldier through the mud as shells exploded behind them. The forest was burning, trees collapsing in sheets of fire. When they reached the safety of a half-collapsed farmhouse at the edge of the clearing, Reed fell against the wall, gasping. His unit had splintered, half scattered in retreat, half buried somewhere under the black smoke that smothered the valley. Rain began to fall, hissing as it met the flames. "Where the hell is everyone?" Hayes panted. Reed peered through a hole in the wall. "Dead, lost, or running." The farmhouse smelled of dust and burned grain. Old wooden beams sagged, and the floor was carpeted with shattered glass. It was shelter, at least for a few minutes. Reed motioned Hayes to help lay the injured man on a table. He lit a flickering lantern, its weak glow pushing back the darkness. The man on the table groaned once, then went still. Reed pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Nothing. His hand stayed there longer than necessary, as if waiting for a miracle that wouldn't come. Hayes slumped into a chair, wiping grime from his face. "We can't save everyone, Sam. You've got to start believing that." Reed said nothing. He took off his helmet, running a trembling hand through his sweat-matted hair. "We save whoever's breathing. That's the rule." The sound of the rain grew heavier, turning to a steady drumming. Then, beneath it, a faint noise. Not thunder. A whimper. Reed froze. He turned toward the doorway that led deeper into the farmhouse. Another sound came, a cough, weak and wet. Hayes heard it too. He raised his rifle. "Stay back." Could be Krauts. Reed held up a hand. Or could be someone dying. He moved toward the sound, pistol drawn, boots crunching over debris. The hallway was narrow, the ceiling cracked. He pushed open a door and stopped dead. 3 men lay sprawled across the floor, wrapped in blood-soaked blankets. Their uniforms, gray, torn, unmistakable. German soldiers. One was barely conscious, muttering in his own tongue. Another clutched a wound in his chest, eyes glassy but alive. The third, just a boy, 16 at most, stared at Reed with hollow terror, whispering, "Nicked Skiason, bit. Don't shoot. Please." Hayes appeared behind him. "Son of a, they're Nazis." "They're dying," Reed replied. "Exactly why we should leave them." Reed knelt beside the nearest one, the older man with the chest wound. Blood pulsed weakly through his fingers. Reed opened his medical bag. Hayes swore under his breath. "You're not serious," he said. Reed didn't look up. "Help me. We've got orders." Command said no enemy wounded, leave them for the MPs. "Orders don't matter to the dead," Reed said quietly. He ripped a strip of cloth, pressing it to the wound. "Hold this." Hayes hesitated, then obeyed, muttering curses. As Reed worked, lightning illuminated the room, revealing the faces of the Germans, frightened, broken, human. The young one's breath hitched as Reed approached. "Wasser," he whispered. Reed handed him his canteen. The boy drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. Hayes looked away. "You're gonna get us killed for this," he said. "Maybe," Reed replied. "But not today." Hours passed in the flickering lamplight. The rain became a steady rhythm against the roof. Reed cleaned wounds, stitched gashes, checked pulses. The language barrier didn't matter, pain was universal, and mercy needed no translation. The older German grabbed Reed's sleeve once, whispering, "Danke." Reed nodded, unable to respond. Hayes busied himself by barricading the windows with broken planks. "You realize if a patrol finds us, they'll court-martial you. Aiding the enemy, Sam. That's not a slap on the wrist." Reed tightened the last bandage. "Then they can court-martial my conscience." Silence hung between them. Hayes dropped onto a chair, shaking his head. "You think you're saving souls. You're just prolonging suffering." Reed sat beside the wounded Germans, exhausted. "I don't care about souls," he murmured. "I care about not becoming what we're fighting." The wind howled through the cracks, carrying the scent of smoke and earth. Outside, the night was alive with distant explosions, war grinding on, indifferent to the mercy inside the farmhouse. For a while, there was nothing but breathing. Then, faint at first, the rumble of engines. Hayes stiffened. "You hear that?" Reed listened. Trucks, somewhere down the road. Voices shouting in English. Relief surged, reinforcements. But then came another sound, the sharp clatter of German speech. Hayes cursed softly. Mixed units. Could be anyone. Reed blew out the lantern. Darkness swallowed the room. "Quiet," he whispered. They crouched in silence, hearing boots slosh through mud outside. A beam of light swept across the window, pausing on the cracks in the wall. Reed's pulse thudded in his ears. The young German whimpered, and Reed pressed a hand gently over his mouth. "Shoo," he whispered. "Bit, ruhig." The door creaked open. A silhouette filled the frame, helmeted, rifle raised. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Then the man barked something in German, sweeping his flashlight across the room. It illuminated Reed's face for an instant. He raised his hands slowly. The soldier hesitated, eyes narrowing. Another figure stepped behind him, American uniform, muddy and familiar. "Hold your fire. They're medics." The tension broke like glass. The Germans lowered their rifles, uncertain. The Americans outside shouted orders, spreading out. The first soldier muttered something and backed away. The door slammed shut again. Reed let out the breath he'd been holding. "That was close," Hayes said, wiping his brow. "Too close." Reed lit the lantern again, though his hands trembled. "We can't stay here." "No kidding," Hayes replied. "We move now while it's quiet." Reed looked down at the wounded Germans. The boy had fallen asleep, lips pale. The older man was slipping away, breath shallow and wet. Reed leaned close. "You'll be okay," he said softly. The man's eyes fluttered open. He whispered something Reed didn't understand, then smiled faintly. A sound escaped his throat, half sigh, half prayer, and then nothing. Reed sat back, staring. Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Sam. Let's go." Reed didn't move. The rain had eased, replaced by the distant hum of planes. The night outside was flickering again, the unmistakable pulse of approaching bombers. Hayes realized it at the same moment. Oh, hell. The ground began to tremble. The low drone became a scream. Reed looked toward the window and saw the sky light up with tracer streaks. "They're bombing the ridge." "Then we're next," Hayes snapped. Reed glanced at the surviving Germans, the boy and the wounded soldier. He knew what orders demanded. He knew what common sense screamed. But looking at their faces, he couldn't move. The first explosion hit half a mile away. The walls shuddered. Dust rained from the ceiling. Hayes grabbed Reed's arm. "If we don't leave now, we die here." Reed tore free. "Help me move them to the cellar." "You've lost your damn mind." "Help me." For a heartbeat, Hayes stood frozen. Then he cursed and grabbed the nearest German under the arms. They hauled him across the floor as the next blast cracked the roof. Tiles fell like stones. The cellar was little more than a pit beneath the kitchen, accessible by a half-rotten trapdoor. They shoved the Germans down first, then followed, slamming the hatch just as the world erupted. The house shook violently. Dust and smoke filled the air. Reed threw himself over the boy, shielding him as beams splintered above. Hayes shouted something, but it was lost in the roar. And then, silence. Minutes passed before either of them moved. The smell of smoke and wet soil was suffocating. Reed coughed, pushing debris aside. A faint glow filtered through cracks above, fire eating what was left of the farmhouse. Hayes spat blood. "You're insane, you know that?" "Probably," Reed said hoarsely. They waited until the sounds outside faded, no more planes, no more explosions. Only the slow, crackling death of the house above. When they finally emerged, dawn had begun to touch the horizon. The farmhouse was a ruin, roof gone, walls half standing. The rain had stopped, leaving a mist over the fields. Reed surveyed the wreckage. The Germans were still alive. Somehow, they'd made it. Hayes leaned against the wall, exhausted. "We should have been killed 10 times over tonight." Reed didn't reply. He walked to the doorway, staring out at the gray morning. Smoke curled from the distant hills where the front line stretched, endless and cold. Somewhere out there, the war raged on. But here, for the moment, there was still breath. Behind him, Hayes muttered, "What now?" Reed didn't answer right away. He looked back at the cellar entrance where the wounded lay, the boy watching him with frightened eyes. Reed's uniform was torn, his hands caked in dried blood. The weight of his decision settled on him like a stone. "We keep them alive," he said finally. Hayes exhaled sharply. "Even if it kills us?" Reed met his gaze. "Especially if it kills us." Outside, the wind carried the faint toll of distant church bells, a haunting sound that didn't belong to either side. Reed listened, eyes fixed on the pale sky. The war was far from over, but somewhere within the wreckage, he felt something stir, a fragile, defiant sense of purpose. He turned back toward the wounded, rolling up his sleeves once more. Hayes cursed softly and followed. The bells kept ringing. And in that broken farmhouse, amid the ashes of battle, the first fragile act of mercy began to take root. The morning after the bombing was a pale, bruised thing. Smoke hung over the fields like an afterthought of destruction, and the farmhouse creaked beneath its own weight. Captain Samuel Reed awoke on the dirt floor of the cellar, every muscle aching. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then the scent of blood and ash returned, and so did the memory. He sat up, blinking through the dim light filtering through a crack in the boards above. Corporal Hayes snored beside him, head resting on his pack. The 2 surviving Germans lay nearby, one older, one impossibly young. Both were pale, feverish, half buried under a blanket Reed had torn from the farmhouse ruins. Their breaths came shallow and uneven. Reed checked their pulses one by one. Still alive. He let out a slow breath. It wasn't relief, it was duty. You stubborn bastards, he muttered quietly, though he wasn't sure who he meant, them, or himself. Hayes stirred, eyes half open. Sun's up? Barely. Reed leaned against the wall, rubbing grit from his hands. How's your leg? Hurts like hell, thanks for asking. Hayes stretched, grimacing. We need to move before a patrol spots us. This place'll draw attention. Reed shook his head. They can't be moved. The older ones lost too much blood. The kid's running a fever, if we drag them out there, they'll die within an hour. Then maybe that's fate, Hayes muttered. We've done more than enough. Reed ignored the remark. He rummaged through his medical bag, counting supplies. Not much left, 2 morphine shots, 1 roll of bandage, a few iodine tablets, and a single syringe that had seen better days. The war had eaten everything, even mercy. Hayes lit a cigarette, the smoke curling toward the ceiling. You know command won't look kindly on this. Saving Krauts after disobeying evacuation orders? They'll hang your stripes off a tree. Reed met his gaze. You want to go? Go. I'm staying. Hayes exhaled, shaking his head. You're out of your mind, Sam. I swear, you'd patch up the devil himself if he called for a medic. Reed gave a tired half-smile. If he's bleeding, probably. They fell silent. Outside, a crow called from somewhere beyond the fog. The world felt distant, suspended. By noon, the sun burned weakly through the haze. Reed moved the Germans from the cellar to what was left of the farmhouse's kitchen, less damp, more light. The young one, barely conscious, mumbled in German as Reed changed his bandages. The older soldier, maybe 30, maybe 40, watched silently, pain flickering behind his eyes. Reed spoke softly, knowing they barely understood. You're safe here. For now. The older man murmured something Reed couldn't catch, but the tone was clear. Gratitude. Hayes paced the room, restless. You realize they might have killed our boys a week ago. Could have been the same bastards who shelled our convoy. Reed didn't look up. Maybe. But right now, they're just men who need a doctor. Hayes kicked at a broken plank. A doctor doesn't get shot for compassion. No, Reed said, voice low. He just lives with himself after. That silenced Hayes for a time. As the hours dragged on, Reed's body worked by habit, cleaning wounds, changing dressings, forcing sips of water. Sweat slicked his face, but his hands never stopped. He'd done this in tents, trenches, and hospitals made of canvas and prayer. But here, in enemy territory, it felt different. Every pulse he found was a rebellion against the war itself. Late afternoon brought footsteps outside. Both men froze. Hayes snuffed his cigarette, grabbing his rifle. Reed moved to the shattered window, peering through the cracks. 2 silhouettes trudged down the dirt road, American uniforms, rifles slung. Patrol, Hayes whispered. Ours. Reed's pulse quickened. Hide them. What? You heard me. Move them under the table, cover them with blankets. Now. Hayes swore but obeyed. They dragged the wounded Germans beneath the heavy wooden table, piling debris and burlap sacks on top. Reed snatched the lantern, setting it near the wall to cast long shadows. Moments later, boots crunched outside. A voice called out, U.S. medics inside? Reed straightened. Yeah. The door swung open, revealing 2 mud-streaked soldiers. One looked barely 20. The other had a hard, watchful face. Captain Reed, the older one asked. That's right. Command's been looking for you. Thought you were dead. His gaze swept the wrecked room. What the hell happened here? Bombing run caught us last night, Reed said. We've been patching up survivors. The young soldier stepped closer. Any Krauts around? Reed forced a calm expression. Not anymore. The men exchanged a look. HQ's pulling back to the ridge. You need to come. There's talk of a counterattack. Reed hesitated. Hayes looked at him sharply. We'll join you soon, Reed said finally. Got wounded here, I can't move yet. The older soldier frowned. Orders are clear, Captain. Everyone pulls out. Reed nodded. I understand. But you see anyone else alive around here? The soldier studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Fine. Suit yourself. But if you're not back by nightfall, you're on your own. They left without another word. The sound of their boots faded into the mist. Hayes slumped into a chair, exhaling hard. You're digging your own grave, Sam. Maybe, Reed said. He lifted the burlap, checking the Germans. The boys' fever had worsened. But not theirs. That night, rain returned, a soft, steady whisper against the roof. Reed sat by the fire he'd coaxed from scraps of wood, the lantern flickering beside him. Hayes slept fitfully, twitching in his dreams. The Germans dozed nearby, wrapped in blankets. Reed couldn't sleep. His mind wandered back to medical school in Boston, the white walls, the smell of antiseptic, the idealism that once felt unshakable. A medic treats all wounds, his instructor had said. Not flags. It sounded naive now, but in this broken house, it was all Reed had left to believe in. He stared into the fire, lost in thought, when a weak voice stirred him. The older German was awake. He gestured weakly toward his chest. Reed leaned close. Pain? The man nodded, breathing shallowly. Reed reached for the morphine, hesitating. One shot left. He looked at Hayes. If either of them got hit again, that dose could mean the difference between life and death. The German watched him, understanding. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. Neen, du, he whispered. You. Reed's jaw tightened. Don't talk. But the man kept staring at him with quiet insistence, as though forgiving him for something Reed hadn't done yet. Reed turned away, injecting the morphine into the man's arm before he could refuse again. The German sighed, relief washing over his face, and closed his eyes. Reed sat back, staring at the syringe. Hayes stirred but didn't wake. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far away. When dawn came, the farmhouse was quieter. The older German still breathed, though faintly. The boy was burning with fever, his skin hot as iron. Reed soaked a rag and laid it across his forehead, whispering, "Hold on." The boy stirred, murmuring in his own tongue. One word came clear, mutter. Reed swallowed hard. He hadn't heard anyone say that word in months. Not with such longing. By mid-morning, the boy began to seize. Hayes rushed over, holding him down while Reed fumbled for the syringe, empty. He cursed under his breath, doing what he could to steady the convulsions. The boy gasped once, twice, and went still. Reed froze. Then he leaned down, listening for a heartbeat that wasn't there. Hayes lowered his head. Jesus. Reed's hands shook as he closed the boy's eyes. For a moment, he just knelt there, unable to move. The war had taken another, and this one didn't even wear the same flag. Hayes stood, pacing. We can't stay here anymore. He's gone. The other one's half dead. What are we doing, Sam? Playing God? Reed didn't answer. He reached for his notebook and tore a page from it. With a stub of pencil, he wrote a single line, then folded it and slipped it into the boy's uniform pocket. Hayes watched him. What's that? A name, Reed said quietly. So someone remembers him. Hayes looked away, jaw tight. You can't save them all. I'm not trying to, Reed said. Just one at a time. The older German groaned softly. Reed moved to his side. His breathing was ragged, but his eyes were clear. He pointed weakly toward his chest pocket. Reed reached in and found a small photograph, faded, creased. A woman and a little girl stood smiling beside a field. The soldier gestured for Reed to keep it, whispering something Reed barely caught. "If I die, tell them." Reed nodded, though he didn't know how he'd ever find them. Hayes turned toward the door. "I'll fetch more water. Try not to take in any more patients while I'm gone." Reed managed a faint smile. No promises. When Hayes left, the farmhouse grew eerily still. The wind pressed against the windows, and Reed could hear distant rumbling again, artillery, far off but moving closer. The war never really stopped, it just circled, like a storm waiting to break again. He cleaned the blood from his hands, the motions mechanical. Outside, the clouds gathered, dark and heavy. He wondered if anyone out there was doing the same, some German medic, maybe, tending an American prisoner and wondering if mercy was worth the risk. The older German stirred once more. Reed knelt beside him. "Rest," he said softly. The man's lips moved. "You, good man." Reed shook his head. "Just tired." The German smiled faintly, eyes closing. His breathing slowed, then stopped. Reed sat beside him for a long time, staring at nothing. Hayes returned with the water, saw the still body, and said nothing. He set the bucket down, his face grim. After a while, he asked, "So what now?" Reed folded the photo carefully, slipping it into his breast pocket. "Now we bury them." They worked in silence, digging shallow graves behind the farmhouse with their helmets. The rain returned before they finished, soft but steady. When it was done, Reed stood over the two mounds of earth, hands trembling. He had no prayers left, only words. "They were soldiers," he said. "And we were men." Hayes looked at him, something unreadable in his eyes. "You think any of this matters?" Reed met his gaze. "I have to." As they turned back toward the farmhouse, thunder cracked again, closer this time. The wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of engines, trucks, maybe tanks, rolling in the distance. Reed stopped, listening. Hayes frowned. "They're moving this way." Reed's eyes hardened. "Then we're out of time." He glanced once more at the fresh graves, then at the road vanishing into the mist. "We move tonight," he said. "With whatever's left." Hayes sighed. "You never quit, do you?" Reed adjusted his pack, his voice quiet but certain. "No, Hayes. Not when there's still someone breathing." The rain fell harder, erasing their footprints as they disappeared into the haze. Two medics, one carrying a secret, both walking deeper into a war that refused to end. And behind them, the farmhouse stood silent, a monument to mercy that no one would ever read about. Rain followed them as they left the ruins behind. It fell in slow, heavy drops, soaking their uniforms and turning the road into a river of mud. Captain Samuel Reed trudged forward, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of his pack. Beside him, Corporal Hayes limped, his rifle slung low, the muscles in his jaw tight. They hadn't spoken in hours. The silence between them was a truce, fragile, necessary, and brittle as glass. They carried what was left of their supplies, a half-empty medical kit, a blanket, a tin of rations. In the back of a rickety cart they'd scavenged from the farmhouse lay one wounded man, an American private they'd found half dead near the forest edge that morning. The irony was bitter. After all the risk Reed had taken to save enemy soldiers, now it was his own who needed him. The private stirred, groaning softly. Reed glanced back, eyes weary but alert. "Stay still," he said. "You'll make it worse." The man muttered something about home and slipped back into delirium. Reed turned forward again, scanning the tree line. Somewhere to the east, gunfire rattled faintly, followed by the deep, distant echo of artillery. The war was crawling their way again. By dusk, they reached an abandoned church on a hill overlooking a flooded valley. Its bell tower was cracked, its windows shattered, but it stood, barely. Reed motioned toward it. "We'll rest there." Inside, the air was cold and damp. Pews lay overturned, hymnals torn and scattered. A crucifix hung crooked above the altar, the face of Christ scorched by fire. Reed set his pack down and began tending to the wounded private, lighting a candle for warmth. The flicker painted shadows on the stone walls, ghosts of light that seemed to move when no one did. Hayes collapsed onto a pew, rubbing his leg. "You know what this looks like, don't you?" Reed didn't look up. "What?" "Desertion. That's what command will call it. You drag a half-dead enemy halfway across Germany, ignore orders to retreat, and now we're hiding in a church while the army moves on." Reed's hands paused briefly over the bandages. "I'm not hiding," he said. "I'm working." Hayes laughed bitterly. "You keep telling yourself that." Reed didn't answer. The candlelight flickered against his face, carving deep lines of exhaustion there. He'd stopped thinking about the war as something to win. It had become something to survive, and something not to lose himself in. He finished dressing the private's wound and sat back, stretching his sore hands. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Outside, thunder rolled again, followed by the faint mechanical growl of approaching vehicles. Reed tensed. Hayes heard it too. Engines. He reached for his rifle, moving to the door. Could be ours. Could be theirs. Reed doused the candle, plunging them into darkness. They crouched behind the stone altar, listening. Headlights cut faint lines through the fog outside. Voices, American. Relief washed through Reed. He stepped out, raising his hands. U.S. Army. Friendly. A beam of light swung toward him, blinding. Identify yourself. Captain Samuel Reed, 45th Infantry, Medical Corps. After a pause, the light lowered. A familiar voice called out. "Well, I'll be damned." "Reed?" From the mist emerged Major Kessler, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven despite the war. He looked Reed up and down, then at Hayes. "We thought you were gone." "Not yet," Reed said. Kessler's gaze shifted to the wounded private on the cart. "Picked up a stray, I see. And what about those you left behind?" Reed hesitated. "Buried them." Kessler studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. "Enemy?" Reed didn't reply. That was answer enough. Kessler sighed, rubbing his temples. "You know what this looks like, Captain. Disobedience. Aiding the enemy. You've crossed more than lines, you've crossed the law." Reed met his eyes steadily. "I crossed to save lives." Hayes stepped forward. "He did what none of us had the guts to. Those men were dying, sir. He couldn't just walk away." Kessler regarded them both. "You're soldiers. You follow orders." "Not when they're wrong," Reed said quietly. For a moment, the only sound was rain on the roof. Then Kessler's tone softened. "You're a good man, Reed. But good men die quick out here." He glanced at Hayes. "We're setting up a field station 2 miles east. Bring your wounded and report there. After that, we'll sort everything else." Reed nodded once. "Understood." When the major left, Hayes exhaled sharply. "We're not done with this, are we?" Reed shook his head. "Not by a long shot." They moved at dawn, following Kessler's convoy through the fog. The road twisted between bombed-out farms and forests stripped bare by winter. The field station was a collection of tents and trucks pitched beside a river, temporary, chaotic, and overcrowded. Reed was immediately pulled into triage duty, his reputation preceding him. For 2 days, he worked without rest, patching wounds, amputating limbs, stitching faces he'd never remember. Each scream became background noise. Each death, another heartbeat lost in the chorus of war. Hayes moved among the stretchers, assisting, though his limp worsened. On the 3rd night, Reed was summoned to Kessler's tent. The major sat behind a folding table littered with reports. "Sit," he said. Reed obeyed. Kessler slid a paper across the table. "These came from HQ. They've reviewed your record, commendations, citations, and the recent incident." Reed scanned the report. Words like insubordination, collaboration, and ethical breach blurred before his eyes. "They're recommending court-martial," Kessler said. "But I've delayed it. You're too valuable here. We need every medic we can keep breathing." Reed's jaw tightened. "So I keep saving lives until they decide whether to punish me for it." Kessler's gaze softened slightly. "You don't see the bigger picture, Sam. Mercy in the wrong place can cost more lives than it saves." Reed stood slowly. "Then maybe your picture's too small, sir." He left before Kessler could answer. Outside, the rain had stopped. The camp was quiet except for the low murmur of the river. Reed walked among the sleeping tents, past rows of the wounded, their faces half-lit by lanterns. His hands trembled, though he wasn't cold. He felt hollow, like something vital had been scraped out of him and replaced with duty. At the edge of camp, he found Hayes smoking, staring out toward the dark river. "You heard?" Reed asked. Hayes nodded. "They'll make an example of you if they can. Heroes don't last long when they disobey." Reed sat beside him. "I didn't do it to be a hero." "I know." Hayes flicked ash into the mud. "You did it because you still think mercy matters." Reed's voice was quiet. "It does." They sat in silence for a while. Then, faintly, they heard the whistle of incoming shells. Hayes looked up sharply. "Artillery." The first impact hit the far edge of the camp, throwing mud and fire into the air. Sirens wailed. Men shouted. Reed was on his feet before he realized it, grabbing his kit. Explosions ripped through the tents. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Reed ran toward the chaos, pulling the wounded from the flames. Hayes followed, limping but relentless. A shell struck near the supply truck, the blast throwing them both to the ground. Reed's ears rang. When his vision cleared, he saw Hayes sprawled beside him, clutching his leg, blood pooling fast. "Stay with me," Reed shouted, dragging him behind a sandbag wall. He tore open his kit, but his supplies were nearly gone. The irony burned in his throat. He pressed his hands over the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Hayes grimaced. "Guess this is what you get for mercy, huh?" "Don't you dare," Reed said, voice shaking. "Not now." Another shell exploded nearby. The blast flattened tents and hurled debris. Reed ducked over Hayes, shielding him with his own body. When the dust settled, half the camp was gone. He worked mechanically, bandaging, stitching, screaming for help that never came. Hours blurred. At some point, the shelling stopped, replaced by the low moans of the wounded and the hiss of burning fuel. When dawn broke, Reed sat beside Hayes, exhausted. The bleeding had slowed, but his friend's face was pale. Hayes forced a smile. "You're still here." "Not going anywhere," Reed said. "Figures." Hayes coughed weakly. "Guess mercy's contagious." Reed tried to smile, but his eyes stung. By mid-morning, Kessler arrived with reinforcements. The camp was a ruin of mud and smoke. He surveyed the damage, then turned to Reed. "You kept them alive," he said quietly. Reed didn't look up from Hayes. Not all. Kessler crouched beside him. You did more than most would've. That's why you're still breathing. He hesitated, then added, HQ rescinded the court-martial. You're cleared. Officially. Reed blinked, stunned. Why? Because word spreads, Kessler said. Those men you saved back there, the Germans? One of them's alive. POW camp north of here. He told his interrogators what you did. Command wants to make an example, but of the right kind, this time. Reed didn't answer. He looked at Hayes, who was drifting in and out of consciousness. The man had followed him through fire, through madness, through mercy itself. As night fell, the camp began to rebuild. Reed sat outside his tent, staring at the river reflecting the faint glow of fires. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. Somewhere in the dark, men cried out in their sleep. He thought of the German boy, of the photograph he still carried in his pocket. He thought of Hayes bleeding under his hands. And he thought of what Kessler had said, that mercy cost too much. Maybe it did. But so did indifference. He reached into his pocket, unfolded the photograph, and looked at it under the moonlight. A woman and a little girl smiling, untouched by the war that had stolen everything else. He slipped it back carefully, almost reverently. Behind him, Hayes stirred, muttering his name. Reed turned, kneeling beside him. Rest, he whispered. You're safe now. Hayes opened his eyes briefly, smirking. Safe? You sure about that? Reed's reply was soft. No. But we're alive. That'll do. Hayes closed his eyes again, drifting into uneasy sleep. Reed sat there long after the fires burned low, the night pressing close. The river murmured below, indifferent to the dead and the living alike. He realized then that compassion carried its own kind of wound, one that never healed but never should. When dawn finally came, it found him still awake, staring toward the horizon where smoke met sky. He had saved enemies, lost friends, defied orders, and carried guilt like a second skin. But as the first light touched the water, he felt something small, fragile, and persistent, hope. And though the war raged on beyond the hills, he understood that mercy, once given, was never wasted. It only waited, for the world to remember what it meant to be human. Snow blanketed the world in silence. The war had dragged into winter, and the forest around the makeshift field hospital stood motionless beneath a gray sky. The air smelled of antiseptic and smoke. Captain Samuel Reed sat on a wooden crate outside the main tent, his breath clouding in the cold. His hands, scarred, trembling, raw from months of unending work, cradled a tin cup of coffee gone cold long ago. He didn't drink it. He just held it, as if warmth could return through will alone. Inside, the moans of the wounded drifted like ghosts. The hospital was full, too full. Men lay shoulder to shoulder, shivering under blankets, whispering prayers to gods they hadn't spoken to before the war. Supplies were scarce again. Reed had lost count of how many times he'd watched a man slip away for lack of morphine or clean bandages. Hayes was alive, but barely. He'd survived the shelling weeks before, though his leg was gone now, the stump still healing. He slept in the far tent, often waking in sweats, his mind replaying the chaos that had nearly ended him. Reed checked on him hourly. It was the only routine that still made sense. Major Kessler had moved on, taking most of the command eastward toward what the brass called the final push. But Reed stayed behind with a skeleton crew, medics, nurses, and volunteers, to tend the forgotten. The ones left in the wake of glory. A wind howled through the camp, carrying with it the faint rumble of artillery from miles away. Even from here, the war sounded endless. Reed looked toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those distant guns, the Germans were collapsing, surrendering piece by piece. Victory was close, they said. But victory meant nothing to him anymore. Not after what he'd seen. Not after what he'd done. He rose stiffly and entered the tent. The air inside was thick with the mingled smells of blood, sweat, and iodine. Lanterns hung low, their flames dim. A nurse, Martha Klein, a soft-spoken woman from Iowa, met his eyes. "Captain," she said quietly. "We just got another one." Reed nodded. "Where?" "Truck from the front line. They say he's German." He hesitated. That word still carried weight. He'd saved Germans before, but the memory of it had nearly destroyed him, cost him his reputation, his command, his peace. "Still," he said, "bring him in." They wheeled the stretcher through the flap. The man was young, barely older than 20. His uniform was torn, his chest soaked in blood. Shrapnel wounds, deep, ragged, mortal. His eyes fluttered open briefly, and Reed saw the same fear he'd seen 100 times before. It was universal. Ageless. Reed crouched beside him, cutting away the fabric. "Pressure dressing," he said calmly. Martha obeyed. "Pulse?" "Faint." "Get me plasma." "And morphine." The young man's lips moved. He whispered something in German, voice cracked and weak. Reed didn't understand all of it, but one word was clear: Schwester. Sister. He was calling for family. Reed's chest tightened. "Tell him he's safe," he said softly. Martha translated. The soldier blinked once in understanding. Hours passed in the slow rhythm of triage. Reed worked as if time itself could be beaten into submission by will. But the wound was deep. Too deep. The bleeding wouldn't stop. When Martha stepped away to fetch more bandages, the soldier's hand found Reed's sleeve. His grip was surprisingly strong for a dying man. Reed leaned close. "You'll be all right." The soldier shook his head faintly. His other hand groped at his pocket, trembling. Reed reached in and pulled out a folded paper, a photograph. He opened it. A woman and a child smiled up at him. He felt the world tilt for a moment. It was the same photograph he'd seen before, months ago, in the farmhouse. The boy whose life he'd saved had carried one just like it. He looked back at the soldier, whose lips were forming a name. "Friedrich," Reed whispered. "Your brother?" The soldier's eyes filled with tears. He nodded weakly. Reed's throat closed. He remembered Friedrich, the first German he'd treated, the one who'd nearly died in his arms, the one who'd changed everything. The war had looped back on itself, cruel and circular. Reed swallowed hard. "Rest," he said. "I'll tell him you made it." But he knew the lie even as he spoke it. The soldier exhaled one last, shuddering breath. Reed stayed kneeling there for a long time, the photograph clutched in his hand, until Martha's quiet voice broke through. "Captain?" He rose slowly, staring down at the still body. "Tag him," he said hoarsely. "Mark him as Allied care." Martha nodded, her eyes glistening. "You think we'll ever stop finding them?" Reed didn't answer. He stepped outside instead. The snow was falling harder now, covering footprints, smoothing over the scars of mud and war. He stared at the photograph again, the same woman, the same child. Both brothers had carried the same piece of home into hell. One he had saved. The other, he had lost. He tucked the photo into his jacket and walked toward the river that bordered the camp. The water was half frozen, its surface rippling beneath sheets of ice. He crouched by the edge, his reflection fractured by the current. He barely recognized the face that stared back, older, harder, haunted. Behind him, footsteps crunched in the snow. Hayes approached, wrapped in a blanket, leaning on a crutch. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, voice raspy but warm. Reed glanced over his shoulder. "Neither should you." Hayes smiled faintly. You think they'll end it soon? They say so. Reed looked back at the river. But the dying doesn't care who wins. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Heard about the new one. German, right? Reed nodded. You gonna tell me you didn't think twice before saving him? I didn't have time to think. Hayes chuckled softly. That's the difference between you and the rest of us, Sam. You act first. Ask forgiveness later. Reed's hands tightened. I don't want forgiveness. Then what do you want? Reed's voice dropped to a whisper. An end that means something. Hayes was silent, his breath visible in the cold. Maybe this is it, he said finally. Maybe mercy was the meaning all along. Reed looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, something like peace flickered behind his eyes. The next morning, the sound of engines woke the camp. A convoy rolled in from the east, jeeps, ambulances, supply trucks. Word spread quickly, the Germans had surrendered in several sectors. The war was ending. Martha burst into the tent, breathless. Captain. Orders from command. They're evacuating the hospital. We're moving south by nightfall. Reed stared at her, barely processing. The war, ending? It didn't feel real. He walked through the tents, watching the wounded being loaded onto trucks, nurses packing what little remained of their supplies. Each man they carried was a story unfinished, a life suspended between relief and loss. By afternoon, only a few patients remained. Reed checked each one personally. When he came to the last cot, he stopped. A young boy lay there, 16, maybe 17. Barely old enough to shave. He'd been found wandering the fields after the last shelling, disoriented, bleeding from the chest. They'd done what they could, but his pulse was failing. Reed sat beside him. You're going to be all right, he said gently. The boy's eyes fluttered open. Doctor? Yes. Am I dying? Reed hesitated. You're resting. The boy's lips curved in a faint smile. You sound like my mother. Reed swallowed the lump in his throat. What's your name, son? Eli. The boy coughed, blood flecking his lips. From Ohio. Reed nodded slowly. Then you're almost home. Eli blinked up at the tent ceiling. I dreamed of snow. Thought it was feathers falling from angels. Reed closed his eyes briefly. Maybe it is. The boy's breathing slowed. You'll stay? Until I'll stay, Reed whispered. Minutes passed. The boy's hand went still. Reed sat there long after, staring at the lifeless form, his heart heavy yet strangely steady. Eli was the last patient. The last life he could touch in this endless war. Outside, trucks rumbled to life. Martha called his name, but he didn't move. He reached into his jacket and unfolded the photograph one last time. 2 brothers. A family. A reminder that mercy didn't choose sides, it only chose hearts strong enough to bear it. When he finally rose, the tent was empty. He stepped into the cold light of morning. The snow had stopped, leaving the world silent and new. Soldiers were climbing aboard transports, their laughter tentative, uncertain. Hayes waved from a jeep, grinning weakly. Come on, Captain. Time to go home. Reed looked back once at the camp, the cots, the blood-stained snow, the ghosts. Then he walked forward, slow and deliberate, until the sound of the river faded behind him. As the convoy moved south, the horizon burned gold with dawn. Reed watched it in silence, the photograph resting in his palm. He thought of all the lives he had tried to save, and those he couldn't. He thought of mercy, and its cost, and how every act of compassion left a scar that never faded. Hayes turned to him. What'll you do when it's over? Reed didn't look away from the horizon. Keep remembering. Hayes nodded softly. Yeah. Someone has to. Reed closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the sun break through the clouds. The warmth touched his face, gentle as a blessing. The engines hummed, steady and low. The world ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt unafraid. Maybe war wasn't about who won, he thought. Maybe it was about who remained human enough to remember. And as the convoy rolled toward whatever peace waited beyond the smoke, Captain Samuel Reed whispered a quiet prayer, not for victory, not for glory, but for mercy to outlive the war.